How to Culturally Hybridize is a conversation from the Momentum series that took place at NYU Abu Dhabi between artist and writer Andrea Pagnes and artist and researcher Chinasa Ezugha. They meet to address questions about the complexly layered identities between Igbo, Nigerian and British cultures, as well as the colonial power structures that underlie them. They talk openly about delicate topics that touch upon the struggles and impact of racism, female migrants, intersectional feminism, language as resistance, faith-based action, and abuse within communities. They discuss experiences of discrimination and gatekeeping of opportunities related to inclusivity and labour, and introduce Chinasa's current research, which centers on food as a form of warfare. They conclude by envisioning performance art as an existential practice capable of provoking reflection and action. Chinasa Ezugha is a PhD candidate at the University of Exeter, an assistant arts professor of life art, art as social practice at New York University Abu Dhabi, and a former director of the UK Life Art Development Agency. Her interdisciplinary practice encompasses life art, film and drawing. Welcome to the Momentum of April 9th, 2025.
Chinasa, thank you for accepting to be interviewed by me, and more than an interview, it's a conversation that I would like to have with you together about what does it mean navigating hybrid identity today. And cultural hybridity is often shaped by diaspora experiences that challenge rigid concepts and traditional notions of identity. And this suggests that identities are dynamic, fluid, constantly evolving, ever-changing. And with this in mind, I would like to begin our discussion by asking how you perceive cultural identity in an era characterized by globalization, digital interconnectedness, and which continually influence personal and communal feelings of belonging to one or more cultures. And as someone like you with a Nigerian and English cultural heritage, how do you navigate the intersection and balance the convergence of these two cultures in shaping your own identity? Have you experienced moments when you felt like you didn't fully belong to either culture? Or how do you reconcile or embrace that duality? Do you ever feel pushed to conform to one cultural identity at the expense of the other? And how do you manage or accept that tension? This perception, I believe, impacts your sense of self and how others perceive you. But to summarize this, I would like to start asking you, what is the most precious things that you carry from your father and your mother?
Oh, wow. That's a very, very deep question. First, I would like to say thank you to you and to Verena for this moment. In many ways, I think for many years I've been influenced by your work. I've just always found the space that both of you carry to be one that liberates someone like me to continue to move through existence and to also, in some ways, not feel like existence is something that is fixed. So I thank both of you for this time and for this space. And to sort of try to answer the question that you asked, I think it's a very deep question because I had a very difficult relationship with my father. And I always sort of carried that difficulty in relation to him. but he passed away in 2022. And for the first time in my life, since I became sort of like aware of who this person was in relation to my existence, I realized that the difficulties that I had with my dad were also the difficulties that I have with myself, in that I recognized that parts of my father's existence was held in this very complex culture where as a man you needed to always live up to the expectation. And in some way, I think growing up as a child in the UK, I also tried to live up to that expectation and then found myself in difficult spaces. So for my dad, I always carry this sense of this sense of wanting to belong, but also fighting what it means to belong. With my mother, I believe I carry a sense of justice because my mom was a very gentle soul and also existed between this notion of cultural hybridity because she was born in Manchester, grew up in the UK partly, and then moved to Nigeria, and then most of her teenage life and young adult life was in Nigeria. And then we came back to the UK with her. So her experience was always in flux of these two spaces. But I carry a sense of justice because my mom was always someone who I felt, regardless of the tensions that she was dealing with, she always believed in what was right and what was wrong. And even though I have grown to question some of those things, I believe that her integrity as a person is what gives me the strength that I need to also know how to navigate some of the complexities I face.
And moving from space to space, moving between two spaces, undeniably create tension, metabolical tension inside of us, no? So reflecting on the colonial history, connecting Nigeria and the UK, how do you perceive the historical power structure and dynamics that influence the experience of a cultural hybrid today? Especially concerning, as you said, this internal cultural conflict or external pressure like your father felt, or your mom. And how do you engage with Nigeria tradition today, you know, customs and values, to pass this aspect of Nigerian culture to your children? You are a mom of two beautiful children. While, however, living in a predominantly Western society, in UK, but also here in Abu Dhabi at the New York University where you are teaching, which is, however, a hub of Western power and dominion. You know?
Yes, absolutely. I think if for those that don't know anything about Nigeria, the concept of Nigeria was born by the British during the colonial conquest. Nigeria never existed beyond what we know of it now, based on the Western or the British imposing of this is what we will call this very diverse and multicultural space. I often think of the way that Nigerians view themselves now as one that almost negates the historic or the sort of colonial identity that was placed on us, because we call ourselves Nigerian rather than say Yoruba or Igbo or Hausa. Well, depending on the context, I think. And I think this sort of identity in itself is already complex, because if you were to go to Nigeria, you would find that different parts of Nigeria have different languages, different cultural practices, different ways of being, different belief systems. You know, some parts of Nigeria remain very much entrenched in what the colonial masters left. And then other parts have resisted that in different ways, in the way that they've changed their tradition. And then when you add the layer of, you know, being, say, from my perspective, Igbo, then Nigerian, and then British, you have this sort of space that isn't a linear space, that requires careful navigation. Because depending on where I find myself, like being here in the UAE, I find myself having to say that I am British in order to not be treated a certain way. You know, like saying that I am a British and showing my passport and being able to hold on to that nationality means that I have certain types of, you could say, perks. And it means that socially, my life is perhaps easier than if I was to say I am Nigerian and I have a Nigerian passport, because of the politics of the land, but also because of the way that colonial ideology has shaped the ideas of who gets to be seen and who doesn't. So even in a space like this, as you rightly said, it's still a very Western space. It's still a space that is, you know, heavily influenced by Western ideology. And yet, at the same time, it's also a space that is in context, or not context, it's in flux of itself, it's in conflict with itself, because the Western ideology is often dismantled when we start to think about, well, my parents are from here, I am from here, I speak this language, I speak that language, I have these practices. My existence isn't solely based on how I'm being ascribed. And even in that idea, for example, I will often have colleagues who will say, oh, you're Nigerian here, because it makes it seem more exotic than it actually is. Because am I really Nigerian? Or am I a British that's been cloned through this notion of Nigerianness? Because let's not forget, Nigeria exists because of the British. The concept of Nigeria exists because of the British. The concept or the existence of an Igbo woman, which I am, does not exist because of the British concept. So am I a Nigerian or am I an Igbo? But when people sometimes negate these spaces, it's often because there isn't yet an understanding of how do we move between these complex histories to arrive to a place where we can actually say, honestly, perhaps I'm a very convoluted person, and it's okay to be convoluted. It's okay to not fully understand and to try to navigate that. I think for my kids, my son was born in the UK, but my daughter was born in the UAE. So there's a question of, you know, when they grow up, will they have the same experience, or will they be more accepting because they're living in a world where technology means everybody is somewhat a hybrid. You know, some people's existence are not solely just based on their nationality these days. Technology, internet has made it possible for people to connect with each other from any part of the world. And so how does identity change when we think about how AI is creating, you know, you could say different digital nationals? What happens when the existence that we've held on to so much, which is, you know, the passport and the citizenship, which we can see with Trump, the breakdown of what it actually means to say I'm an American is so present now. where do we go to find a sense of, nationality or citizenship? And I can say that perhaps my children, I don't know how to navigate that. I think it's a big unknown, because I realize that in many ways, the digital world is perhaps going to play a more prominent role in how they're identified than, say, it did for me.
I want to touch a topic that for me is very important also in my research, because I've been working with quite several young refugees, and it's about migration. And you yourself, I met you that you were a young performer, and then when I met you again, you were the director of the Live Art UK Development Agency, and then you came here, you migrate here because of work offer, but this question of the migration brings me to think a lot about exploited labor and all those people that are forcibly displaced because they don't have resources, a welfare system in their country of origin. So these physical and ideological borders, state policies, and public opinion shape migration experience and influence identity construction, especially today. I am all the time wondering if migration is a source of fragmentation, strength, or both. And how does immigration impact cultural hybridity, especially in shaping a sense of belonging, that you were touching before with the example of your father. So when women, for example, from diverse cultural background come in another place, arrive in another place, often they experience distinct pressure to adhere to traditional expectation in varying cultural contexts. And migrant women in particular confront multiple layers of marginalization related to gender, race, class, cultural displacement, labor exploitation. And so how does cultural hybridization impact women's agency as they navigate migration between different societal frameworks while constantly managing competing norms regarding roles, femininity, autonomy? And so as a Black British woman with Igbo roots, how does this racial identity intersect with cultural hybridity and migration in your experience? Do you find that societal expectation, not only for you, but surrounding Blackness in general, influence your perception of other women and the way that they navigate their own cultural duality? How this migration really impact today, because it's so fast and it's so, you come to a place and you are like catapulted in that place because of you have been forcibly displaced by your place of origin. And the expectation that you find perhaps in the place of hope, let's say, are not as you were imagining before. You come to terms with other conflicts, other structures, power dynamics, and a lot of difficulties to be integrated, because I think that migration then call into question what does mean to be integrated in another culture, in another country, and then be accepted and having the same rights that the citizenship of the country have.
Yeah, and even sometimes when you do have those rights, the rights that you have are marginalized on the basis of what you look like. I say this in relation to...
So the aspect, you mean the aspect, yeah.
Yeah, the aspect, and also, how much of that right can come to you easily and how much of it requires you to actually fight. my mum, when we came to the UK, my mother, although she was already British and we inherited our citizenship from her as her children, I remember very distinctly how hard it was for her. The language was very easy for her to adjust to, but I think what made it complex was the fact that she had been away from this society, she'd been away from this culture for so long. And not only that, but she needed to reintegrate herself back into the society while also integrating us in. And even though we didn't, we were not refugees when we came to the UK, and it was a choice that my parents made for us to come, I would say somehow the heartbreak was when it came to my dad being able to come to the UK, and suddenly there was lots and lots of issues with immigration. The reality for my mum was that she became a single mother of 4 children that she had to not only integrate into this British society, but also had to protect and keep safe, because often people think the UK is this safe haven and is the land of milk and honey, as we also thought when we were kids. The reality is on the streets, you don't have any rights, actually, because as a black child, I remember being in primary school and a child approaching me and saying, do you eat food from the floor? And of course, as a child, that was the most hurtful thing anyone could say. As I grew up, I realized that there was so much more worse things than that. And then even coming to here, for example, this country is, you could say, in many ways, the new United Kingdom, because, everybody from everywhere is here, and everybody from everywhere is looking for an opportunity. Everyone from everywhere is here to become, rich or to get a better opportunity for themselves and their kids. Some of us have come here with a lot of privilege and have been given a lot of privilege. And what I've witnessed is that some people have taken that privilege and have marginalized others in this same space as well, who have come here with the same desire. I often say I have these conversations with nannies who are often on the cusp of this sort of migration and abuse, because many of them migrate here to work, to take care of their kids back home, their families back home, or to have a better life prospect. And then what happens is many of them will say, that they want to work for Western families because they believe they pay better, or that they are somehow more prestigious because of where they're coming from. And then what happens is many of them face this real sort of, I think, I don't know how to describe it without being vivid, but many of them face very terrible lives. And lives that, even in the standard of what we have in the UK would be illegal and would be classed as slavery and, human trafficking and whatnot. And there would be laws to protect. But because there is this distinction between you migrate to a country, for example, here, we all migrated here for a job. And we have our jobs. And then there is the other aspect, which is the migration of labor that comes between either the labor that you give to the job or the labor that is given to you through the people that you employ to help you to do the job that you migrated here for. And in that space, the line between the sort of outside, inside, or the sort of social and private space is blurred, because in that sort of grey line lies sometimes the most difficult and dark experiences. But going back to this notion of whether sort of migration, what happens with migrant women in terms of living up to expectations or moving between this duality. I could say when I worked in the UK, I worked for an art gallery where we worked with refugee women. Many of these women would have suffered to get to the UK and remained suffering because in the context that I met them, many of them were still being moved from city to city without really much stability. Many of them had kids. Many of them were also then props. They were used as props by, the institution to support things like, look at the kind of people that we're working with. This is why the arts is so good for the community, because we're able to reach women like this using these tools and etc. And what usually happened was the women would rehash or reshare their trauma and would talk about the things that led them to come to the UK, for example. And for many, they would have shared that story about 15 times. And it never seems to be enough, because the notion of culture becomes this machine that needs to be fed constantly. And they are the ones that need to feed this cultural machine, because they are the ones that, don't have the right to the job, don't have the right to the house, don't have the right to say no. So they are dependent on this cultural machine to keep requiring them to keep selling their stories, to keep saying it. And at the end of it, all they get is a few cakes and tea and coffee.
What I learned, what I found when you introduced me years ago to the concept of cultural hybridity. On one side, I read some philosophers and critics that respond to the notion of cultural hybridity as sometimes inauthentic because of their stricter conservative views on cultural identity. And from another viewpoint, I approach some feminist theories that, however, also them are often criticized for their Eurocentric hegemonic discourse or culturally specific perspective, notwithstanding some exception like Toni Morrison, Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks. How women of bringing this cultural hybridization has also a resource, as a vital resource, can contribute to deconstruct dominant feminist narrative and supporting a more democratic, inclusive and intersectional feminism, which I also feel good to dismantle patriarchal systematic stains, because I do believe that this new phenomenon, which is not new, but as we are discovering it, especially as Western white male in a way, like I am, although from a gypsy background. I do believe that this unique insight can be a good medicine for the evolution of transnational feminist thought, for example. And so that culture cannot ossify as it seems in many areas of education, also in the Western society, but be rejuvenate or rebooted for the new generation to come also.
I mean, I think the question, or just the things that you've shared is so at the forefront of what we're navigating in this space, because I've had students, so I teach a class called Voice, and in that class, this particular year, I have a very diverse group of students, and it's the first time, I think, or maybe the second time, perhaps, where I've had a sort of a large number of Emirati female students. And one of the things that I love about the students is they come into the space and whatever I offer them, they always come back with a response through their own unique lens. And one of the things, I remember we touched upon this conversation of feminism, and they immediately said, you know, we reject the West and the Western ideology of feminism because it positions our womanhood in relation to the male gaze. And in reality, we don't see it like that. We are the ones that are completely taken care of. We exist in our own feminine selves. We exist in our own feminine bodies and our own feminine collective. Like what it means to be a woman in the Arab context is not from a place of lack or sort of not having a voice. It's a place of power. And yet at the same time, in the class, there are also students who have very different experience. In particular, there's one student who is Kenyan who said, you know, the first time I came to the UAE, not even the UAE, to New York University Abu Dhabi, was the first time I was confronted by this notion of blackness. Because in Kenya, I'm not black. I am my community, you know, I am this person, I am this name, I am this kind of voice. I inhabit a space where, you know, the color of my skin is not what speaks. And of course, for me, that was really challenging because I have grown up in a society where much of what I relate to is always in conversation between this notion of blackness, whiteness, you know, often discrimination, empowerment, space, not having space. So I immediately started questioning, well, what does it mean to be black then? Mm-hmm. Because it's not universal. Yeah. It's Western. Yeah. And so if it's Western, how do we who have grown up in this hemisphere, this Western hemisphere, relate to what others of either the same community, the same country, nationality, view as being completely outside of their existence? Yeah. How do we then bridge that line of, you're black, I'm black, we're supposed to get on, you know? Mm-hmm. Because in this instance, you're black because I am saying you're black, but you are looking at me like, no, you're not black, you're Igbo, you're, you know, this. And that for me is very complex when it becomes a question around feminism. Because then what it means is that the idea of womanhood is also potentially different for those women that have grown up in Igbo land, for example, or those women who have grown up in Yoruba land or in Edo land, where being a female is understood differently. And does that mean that their concepts and ideas of feminism or feminist thinking is not valued in the same way that mine or someone else's? No, it means that, as you said, it's an intersectional space that also is a space where fluidity becomes this mode of re-understanding what feminism looks like. And I think you use the term transnational. And this is so important because I think that what has happened is, you know, I'm going to say this without having like a huge amount of information to back it up. I'm just going to say because it's in my gut. I feel that what the colonial conquest did was it came and it stole ideologies and ways of being that already existed in places in Africa, and that was a way of governing and being with the land and being with the people, and they've turned it into an inquiry that has propositioned the British society as being the most knowledgeable society. And what we have is academia has upheld this notion and has tried to continually uphold it in order to ensure that the voices that are heard are the voices that sound like that of those that said, you know, Sarah Bartram is as an animal, rather than actually recognizing that if she's an animal, then so is Kim Kardashian, because both of them have large, well, one had a natural large buttocks, the other one was enhanced through scientific and medical means. But it's this the same sort of rhetoric that I feel sometimes that academia does uphold, and it's not in a way that it's not to say, well, it's not in a way that opens up a conversation like we are having. It's in a way that refuses or refutes anything that isn't linked to what the West has ascribed as being the center of knowledge. And I just think, like, being in the UAE, being here at NYU ADN, working with a diverse body of students, the questions of what does it mean to exist as a Black British woman is also a question of, do you actually understand what Blackness is and where Blackness comes from? And does that define my womanhood? Or how does my womanhood shift in relation to the space that I find myself in? Is it in relation to other women, or is it in relation to, you know, like men? And I think this is a very complex question, and it's also something that is very relevant to now. I don't think I would have reached this point had I not come to a place like this, and had I not been able to sort of really sit down and think, you know, I've heard from multiple African students who are saying, we're not Black. And yet I am saying, you are Black. But they are saying, I'm not. This notion of Blackness does not exist in my existence.
Yeah.
And it's been, it's been ascribed to me for what purpose?
So you teach a class that is called Voice, no? And it's Voice, we are performer, Voice brings me immediately to language. And yesterday I had the opportunity to have a conversation with one of your brilliant students, young students from the Philippines. And Paolo told me, you know, Andrea, we have 170 dialects. And I asked him then, but Paolo, as a pronoun, how do you go pronoun? We don't have pronoun in my dialect. No? It was quite striking. No? So language serves as a cultural signifier. And I do think that multilingualism can offer greater agency in expressing identity and resisting dominant narratives of programming, as just you have said, no? And at the same time, it can introduce new challenges. Do you think that if we go in the trajectory of also revivifying multilingualism, we provide individuals or young students with more control, or does it bring about another set of issues that I personally cannot foresee yet? No? And also, as you have said before, no, what I perceive is that multilingualism can have an impact on feminist discourse, because what we are talking, what some male colleagues they do not understand that we also start thinking in a feminist way, so how do you perceive the impact that it may have while we are, making resurface these things, and not just speak or have communication and dialogue and interaction with one another, knowing that the parameters that we use are those of the West as it has programmed all of us for centuries.
And I go back to, I have to refer to biblical terms here because it's the one thing that it's my sort of research bank in some ways, that the idea that words were created, or words, the function of words from a biblical standpoint was not to communicate but was to create. And so if we were to think about multilingualism as a space of creation, whereby what we have is creativity as a language that then allows for different interpretation and different ways of being, then surely what it would create is a space where uniqueness is celebrated rather than feared, or, and this idea of knowledge being something that you have to go down a very long, dark route to attain becomes a play, an opportunity to play and to, to play and to discover and to not feel like it's a burden, but it's actually a joy. But also when you talk about this notion of changing the paradigm, what I find so interesting is, I remember last year I had a conversation with a Chinese Malaysian student who, if you listen to her, she sounds like an American, but it's because she went to an international school. But she's Chinese by heritage and Malaysian by nationality. And she talked about this notion of resistance through language. And then it made me think about the different forms that this has shown up. And she was speaking specifically about the resistance of the older Chinese people and the English language. And so what they did was they resisted this notion of confirmation by changing the way the structure of the English language sounds, is spoken, and is experienced. So in the specific area that she was talking about, and I can't remember where she was talking about, I don't know if it was even the Chinese Malay communities. English is spoken, but it's only understood by them, because it sounds completely alien to those of us who are, well, I'm not even a native English speaker, but for those that are native speakers, it sounds very different. It doesn't make sense. And yet they're speaking English. Then it reminded me of Pidgin English in Nigeria, which is a whole different language in itself. It's like, even sometimes when I try to understand Pidgin, I'm just like, what are they talking about? And they're speaking with so much, energy and flair. And then I started to think about, is this way of multilingualism understood through resistance? Is this the way that they are sort of resisting to conform to the colonial power of you must speak like this and you must sound like this? So they create their own hybrid language that is an extension of not just, for example, the English language itself, but it's also the street language, it's also the cultural language, the music, the dance. And then somehow it becomes this thing that only these people can understand. And so when you talk about multilingualism, I think about what you said about, resistance, that surely multilingualism is a resistance to other ourselves when we should be sort of celebrating the beauty of the diversity of our existence. And what the English language has done is it has almost like created this very placid hierarchy that in order for you to sound intelligent, you have to speak good English, or you have to sound like this. And yet, if you think about like the Americans, like in the Black American culture that have their own unique dialects and their own unique ways of speaking, English, it would have been born out of resisting the slave masters during, the times of slavery. But these things are not celebrated enough, because I feel that going back to academia, what academia does is academia upholds this same colonial power that says in order for you to be able to get the stamp of approval, you do need to meet these boundaries. So in that respect, for people like us, when we go into the academic space, we have to navigate how we use our language to either destruct the space or to somehow confront and confront, like what this space is requiring of us. But it's not an easy space. I sometimes tell students, if you can't explain it in English, try to explain it in Arabic or in Tagalog. Get someone to translate, because I obviously don't understand. Or do something with your body so I can think, okay, do you mean this? Because with the body, I feel like it's more direct. But it's, again, I feel like this question that you're asking is also very relevant for this space. And this time, and also thinking about the question you asked at the beginning about globalization. Globalization is bringing us to a place where we do have to confront, whose language have we all adopted? Yeah. And is that serving our purpose, or is that going against our existence?
Yeah. It's very hard to capture adequately the nuances of being a cultural hybrid. There are gaps that must be addressed still. So from your own viewpoint, your own perspective, Chinasa, which narratives are absent, and what changes would you like to see?
So, I've been thinking about the notion of narratives, and I go back to some of my experiences in the UK, particularly as an artist when I was first coming up in the scene. And I would say that I think this also relates to why I decided to do a PhD that focused on what is a biblical phenomenon. I find that sometimes that there isn't enough acceptance or space to exist as a cultural being that is also faith-based, without it being scrutinized like you have done something wrong to someone or you've stolen something from a community. And I feel that there is a dual experience in that. For me, I have a strong sense of justice. And in the past, in my life, I used to, let's say, take revenge on my own hands. I would, find a way to get back. And then I have grown in my faith, in my relationship with God in a way that has also taught me to neglect this notion of self in a very important way, because I think that it's not that the self is not valuable, it's not that the self is not present, but it's just that if the self becomes the only focus, the destruction of the mass is inevitable. Because if we only think about ourselves, there's no point in existing together. And I sometimes feel that there isn't enough space. I think in the art art world, or at least in the performance art world, it feels like there's not enough space for people like me to truly exist in our truest forms. And that's to say that, you know, I have a strong sense of justice. I want to see a community that is diverse. I want there to be a space where, you know, we can exist together, even in the difficulty of existence, that we are committed to moving through that difficulty together. But I also would like to see a space where being a Christian is not a sin. Being a Christian doesn't become the thing that stops this person from seeing the value in me because it doesn't align with their existence. Because I don't align with every existence. However, I'm committed to existing together.
Yeah.
And I also feel like, and this may be controversial for some who are listening, who might find this offensive, but I wish there was more discussions and more narratives about abuse within the Black community. And by Black community, I mean the Black Western community. The African side has its own issues. And I think that there is probably many that are aware of those issues. But from a Western perspective, from the Black community, both American and British, what I have faced in the UK, some of the worst experiences I've had has been from the people who talk about care, who talk about ethics, who talk about diversity, who say that they want to champion, you know, or who are committed and want this space where, you know, our existence is not something that's tokenized. But they create spaces where that tokenism becomes the sort of, I think the plate of the devil. It's filled up with greed, it's filled up with abuse, and somehow it's expected to just be accepted because we're Black and we're gonna support each other because outside, you know, they're white and they're gonna look at us. But it's like, let's stop for a minute and really address the issue, which is that if, regardless of the fact that I'm Black and you're Black, if you abuse me with the same kinds of abuse that you say the white man has shown to you, what's the difference between you and the white man? Is it the color of your skin? Because if it's that, then there's no argument, right? The issue is the abuse remains the abuse. And if you are talking about racism and you want to stop racism and you truly are committed in ensuring that there is a discussion about race and that we as people can talk about the issues of race, how then can you be utilizing the notion of race as a monopoly for who gets to speak and who doesn't? And how do you then decide whether I have the right to speak because I don't align with the kind of Blackness that you align? I think there's not enough conversation about it because, and I know why there's not enough conversation. There's not enough conversation because many of the time people of color, Black people are fighting this existential war that is about the racial framework, the racial system. However, I cannot stay silent and say that the same people that are also fighting this war are also creating this war. I feel like this conversation is critical because this conversation might even give space for the generation that's coming up to recognize what ethics should be applied when we come to deal with these issues. If we don't have an ethical framework that isn't just about Black versus white, but that looks at the existence of human beings and the way that human beings operate and whether those operations align or misalign, then everything that we talk about with race will always, for me, feel very diluted because the work that needs to be done, I don't believe has been done. And I also blame my mother's generation and my grandparents' generation who did not create space for these conversations to be had about why it's important for you to live up to the standard that you expect others to live up to, regardless of your race. And actually, before you can talk about race and the issues of race, you need to look in the mirror and ask yourself, your brother and your sister who are black, did you take food from their plate and their children's plate because of your own initiative? And if you did, what's the difference between you and the slave masters?
People of color, disabled people, people with disability, in institutional setting, sometimes are seen as an asset, sometimes as a liability. Both of these two words, asset and liability, underneath is about all discrimination. A person like you has a position, with, you know, but there is this kind of subtle blow of discrimination in everything, you know. We find it also as a couple teaching sometimes, or as a couple going to events to perform, you know. So these tensions impact the person autonomy, no matter the color or the physical condition or neurodivergent condition. And so with the autonomy, the employment opportunity, they are going to face these traditional expectations that are in the professional environment. And then, you know, how can we respond to this? How can we find a solution that this way of thinking and also this kind of way of thinking that is structured academia, for example, but not only, because it's also in corporation or other jobs, you know, in a way. And then also in the, what are the so-called more humble job that a lot of people that migrate as by force to take. I met in Germany where we live the chief doctor of the Department of Radiology of the Aleppo hospital. And she came because her husband was already in Germany with the children, but she can't find a job proper to her skills. And she went to clean apartments, you know. All these things are for me very confusing. I find a lot of inequalities. I don't find institutions or states that are able to create infrastructures, but then they become, these people also sometimes, the gold medal that they put on their chest to say, okay, look how good we are. But it's not true.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's almost like the, you know, Polish doctorates that come to the UK to be factory workers, you know, and somehow, or the, you know, I remember, I think it was last year, I don't remember which part of Africa he was from, but he was one of the refugees that was held in that, is it Stockholm Bibi, that awful creation that they had somewhere in the UK, and unfortunately he died. And when he died, you know, they suddenly stopped calling him a refugee and recognized that he was a doctor who had escaped his country for a better life. And so I think of these instances as well as it's a form of, it's an injustice. And when you were talking, I started thinking about, you know, what is the true definition of racism? And I think it was, I don't know if it was Malcolm X or one of sort of the civil rights movement activists who basically defined racism as going beyond the skin tone and thinking about, exactly as you said, the economical opportunities that is available to an individual. And the way they described it was that racism is not when you call me the nigger, or the Negro. It's not when you tell me to go back to my country. Racism is when you see me in all that I am and you create a system that says I have no right to advance this position. Racism is where I go to school, I perhaps am the most intelligent out of everybody, and yet I remain in the bottom of the class because the system says someone like you cannot go above this position. Racism is when you intentionally create laws and opportunities and fences that stop an individual, a group of people from advancing and having the same opportunities that everybody else has. And I remember being so moved by that because I suddenly understood that this notion of racism is far more complex than I had even given it space. Because then I started to think, thinking back at what we were discussing about language, if there wasn't a language for racism, what would it be? Would we say discrimination, or would we have something else to say? Because I think about a country like the UK, and I'm sorry to keep going back to the UK, but it's the only one I know in that, in depth in that way. But a country like the UK, there's this facade that everybody has an opportunity. Everybody has the opportunity to eat, to, go somewhere, do this, go to school. It's like a foundational framework that's laid down. But when you really enter the system, when we came to the UK and I became embedded in the system, what I understood was the system is actually tightly woven to ensure that only a percentage of the population gets to a certain place. And maybe we could say that we could look at the UK Parliament now and say, it's not about race. But we've just understood that racism is not on the basis of just skin tone. It's more than that. Mm-hmm. So when you look at the Parliament, you see people of all colors and different genders. Perhaps the most diverse the UK Parliament has ever been. But we have the worst situation as a country where children are going to sleep without food in their belly. Schools are becoming hotbeds for terrorisms and all kinds of stuff. Freedom of speech is challenged daily. The arts and humanities have been completely attacked from every angle. In that respect, you could say the opportunities for people to go into higher education is decreasing day by day. The economy is at the worst place that it could be, and probably could get even worse for all we know. So then the question is this about racism as we understood it to be before, or is this about racism as we have come to understand? And if it is, then how do we navigate this to move away from saying that because an awful human being and a bad person stabbed 3 girls to death, that all Muslims and all blacks are the same, and attack them, to a place where you acknowledge evil for what evil is, and you acknowledge good for what good is, and you stop trying to use this systemic framework that says this color, this religion, this gender equals this, and start to really analyze what we're witnessing. I think the labor is, unfortunately, I think it's going to become one of the biggest sites of, I don't even know how to frame it other than evil. In the same way that migration, because often what people think about migration is they think solely refugees from the standpoint of they're running away from their country because of the wars. That's one aspect. There's climate refugees. There's refugees even from America here, for example, who are not seeing themselves as refugees because from a mental perspective, we've come here to work. But are we not running away from something? Are we not trying to escape something?
Yes.
So are we not then refugees, but we're the privileged refugees, right? So when you think about it, you think, okay, so this notion of labor, I started to think to myself, here I am in the UAE, I have this job, I'm working, and I'm witnessing so many abuses, and I'm trying to understand from a human perspective, how can human beings lack any sort of empathy or framing to help them understand that we're all laborers.
Yeah.
I'm here to do a job. I'm working. I'm a laborer. So what's the difference between my labor and the labor of the nanny that you decide you are going to underpay, you're not going to give a break, you're going to talk down to? What's the difference between your labor and her labor?
Yeah.
Is it the system?
Yeah.
Because one has a system that has been tightly woven to ensure that you keep laboring, but you're under the illusion that you're not laboring. You're just doing a prestigious job.
Yeah.
And the other has no system, therefore is exposed to, or has a system that has exposed them to the microaggression, the racism, the evil, the abuses, the this, the that. And when I really look at the UK from the outside, that's what I see is happening. Everybody in the UK is laboring. Everybody in the UK is part of this tightly woven system. Because unless you're maybe one of the royal family or you happen to be in that line of the elite, you have been economically stopped. You can't go beyond a certain threshold. And for you to go beyond that threshold, you need to change your paradigm. But how do you have time to change your paradigm when you're thinking about your bills, your mortgage, your children, the food, the this, the that, the this, and all of these other things? There's no time. So then when I ask people sometimes to talk to me about racism, both black, white, Asian, you name it, tell me what you understand about racism. They always talk about the color. And then I think, wow, if you just remove the color and consider your condition as a human being. Do you work? Yes. How many hours? How much do you earn? Do you have money to feed your family? Can you go through a month without, using a credit card or this and that? If the answer to any of those questions is no, then ask the next person the same question and then ask yourself, who do we know in the world can live their life without ever worrying about how they're going to pay their bills tomorrow? If you can identify those people, you have identified the ones that are part of the system that says they go up, you go low. So I'm like, there's something, like I keep thinking in my mind, I'm like, there's something that happens when you're in this kind of space, in the UAE, in the Middle East, because the rules here are very different to the West. The rules here is the strongest man wins, or the strongest body wins. So for you to be strong, you have to equip yourself with knowledge. Not just train your body to be physically strong. You have to equip yourself with knowledge. Knowledge that comes both from, being in the midst of people, and knowledge that is also comes from wisdom. For you to understand that your enemies are not the people you think they are. there is something far greater than what we understand. And until you step out and recognize that, oh, I too am a laborer here. And I am too have been somehow convinced that my labor is not the same as theirs. But really, is it not? Because every month I expect a paycheck. If I don't get that paycheck, all hell breaks loose. Because the system is not interested in truly providing a space that is really integral to diversity. The system wants to perform it in order to say they've done it. But at the end of the day, if you don't meet that system where it needs to be met, the system will swallow. Just like Arts Council England. The Arts Council England is interested in feeding the system. That's the reason why they define who gets what funding and who doesn't. Because if you say artists for all, then fund every artist so that they can make art for all. But why do you choose who gets the funding and who doesn't? Because you know the criteria are really different than what you're saying. And you also know that if you fund everyone, then it means that the conversations that we keep within a certain space becomes something else. It becomes communal. It becomes less about trying to create hierarchies, and it becomes about kind of disembodied experience of, you know, like the prestigious spaces of Oxford and the Royals and blah, 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 these different institutions. It becomes really about what the people want. And the people who can give the people what they want are not the ones making the decisions. They are often the ones that are at the mercy of the decision makers who are sitting somewhere. Maybe they're not on the elite bandwidth, but they're on the trajectory.
People are food for the system.
Yeah.
Labor is food, to provide food. The Bible says that solidarity starts when we share our plate with our foe or our friends.
Yeah.
And food is the main topic of your current research.
Yes.
As a form of politics also. It's a very intriguing concept, of course. So if you can share with us a little bit of this.
Sure. I started the research on food in 2016 as part of a commission by it's not Steakhouse Live, it was Rich Mix Radical Ideas, and it was a small seed grant that allowed me to, for the first time, look at the Biafran War that occurred in Nigeria in the 60s. Not just because it relates to my Igbo heritage, but because I wanted to understand how is it possible to use food as a weapon? How can that even be allowed? And I later on found out that after that Biafran War and the way that food was used as a weapon, the UN made a law that food can never be used again as a weapon of warfare. And we know that's a lie because we can see it's happening right now as we speak. It's being used as a weapon of warfare. And even just the, destruction of trade routes means that, the world, many people in the world go into a crisis and famine becomes, the song of Satan and people start to die. So I thought about how do I bring this research to a place where it's not just about creating a production. I was given the opportunity to create a production here in 2023, and I really thought about what is it that I really want to say. I was watching a lot about COP27 and then COP28, and they were talking about this countries like Pakistan asking for justice from the West, because Pakistan, as with the Philippines, and other parts of Africa as well, like Ethiopia and Sudan, are some of the worst places in terms of the effects of climate change. Pakistan goes through a really harsh period of flooding where farmers lose all their crops and people die. The Philippines is seeing like a really high rise in temperature every year. And of course, their monsoon or the flooding is getting worse. And they were asking for money as compensation. And I thought, surely money is not going to solve this, because we're in a place where if money could solve it, it would have. And I wanted to create something here in the UAE where it spoke to the truth of my experience as well, because I can't deny the fact that I have a privilege. I can order food from anywhere in the world just by being here. I have access to almost any type of fruits, vegetables, and sometimes it's easy to forget that this has gone through a process, this has gone through a journey. Someone picked this, and the person that picked this may not get the same reward that I am getting. And also I looked around and I saw like the dining halls on campus and how so easy it is to access food. And then I had an embodied experience where I remembered not having food growing up in Nigeria and what it actually meant to starve and the feeling of starvation. So I really feel like food for me has become this sort of archetype of the many different experiences that I am having in this region, not solely based on the region itself, but what the region brings to my mind, like what the sand enacts in me. Is it reminds me of journeys past and journeys that are to be had. And this question of, what does it actually mean to have a sustainable food system? How do we create that? And, the conversation we had and you talked about when you put plastic in the ground, it affects everything. But there's this distinction between organic and non-organic. Is it truly organic? And there's questions in my mind. I remember my grandfather saying, there were times when we would get the land ready to plant the yams and you had to do it by hand. And sometimes the soil would be so dry because we would have gone through a period where rain didn't come down. So you would spend hours and hours like just plowing this hard soil, hoping that then it will rain and sort of loosen everything up. And my granddad would sometimes say, we don't know if we will get any crops this time around. I heard that the neighbor has yielded a lot more than they expected because they're using a certain type of fertilizer. But I don't want to use, my granddad was very clear. He doesn't want to use fertilizer because he doesn't know what it will do to the soil. He doesn't know how it will change the soil. And it's not just a temporary change. He understood that the soil would be changed forever. And he always had the mindset that I would rather work and sweat and know that what I put into the soil comes from my body and into the soil, because the soil is going to give me what will nourish my body, than to put something I had no control of in the soil and risk basically damaging not just an ecosystem, but the biological system that isn't just him, but it's us, it's, connected. So this project has been one that I think I will continue to think about and to kind of process. But at the moment, the way that I've been trying to frame my research on food is from an autoethnographics point, where I'm thinking, remembering what food experiences I've had, what those experiences say, how it relates to my existence as well, as a Igbo woman, because it's through these sort of research and remembrance that I connect back, and a part of me wants to connect back physically, but I have my own sort of barriers as to why I haven't gone yet. So I try and find ways through creativity to connect back from a metaphysical sense. And for me, the research on food has been that line, to try to connect back to, the life that was in Isekenesi in Imo State in Nigeria, and also where that has brought me. Here I am in Abu Dhabi, New York University. I'm not plowing the soil in that way. I'm trying to plow the minds around me to think about what are we feeding ourselves? Are we feeding ourselves opportunities to grow and to feed the generation to come? Or are we only feeding ourselves to feed ourselves right now and not think about the future? The food ecology is the thing. It's going to be the biggest thing, I think, for how we as human beings navigate this world as we go through climate change.
I found all this in the performance you did in Venice last December, which it was quite physically and also spiritually demanding. You performed for almost 3 hours with a huge old mortar and pestle from Ghana of the 19th century. And it was on one side paying tribute to ancestors and the labor of women. On the other side was calling and claim back this, effort and blood that they spent to feed their family. If I say you this expression, or do you feel that performance art, it is still an existential practice of resistance and honoring? And what does it mean for you, and how you see it in the future, how you place it in the future? I remember that we were saying, curating performance is quite a paradox, You can open a space for performance to come in the space and perform their own concern. And Verena and I really feel a kind of invisible bondage with performers that perform in a mood of resistance, which is not, which is not glorifying resistance, but because it is a mode to celebrate the life of today, the life of the past, and that of the future, where there are, contrary waves of contrary streams, that. So resistance, solidarity, in performance. What is for Chinasa, Vivian?
Wow. I love what you said. The life of today, the life that was, and the life of the future. To honor the life that was is something that is so powerful, because in the honoring, you also are not held down by that sense of grief. Because often people think about the past as something to be aggrieved by, because somehow it's a recognition of our mortality as people. I do believe that performance art is an existential practice. I think that performance art is a practice that perhaps is one of the, when you place a needle into a space and then everybody's looking for that needle, and the only experience you will ever have is when that needle pricks you, that you're like, found it. I feel like sometimes performance art is that needle where you see it, it's placed somewhere, and then the only way to fully grasp it is to feel it. And I don't know that any other forms does that, because I think what performance does is it brings the space and opens it up to say that we are humans, and in this moment we are in our bodies and we need to be in our bodies. We are going to experience what it means to be present in this moment. Even if that moment that we're in together takes us back to the past and shines a light to what the future might hold, I think that performance art is that torch that's, does this. And I only came across this idea of people needing to curate performance or to have curators that specialize in performance art. When I got here, I thought, how can you go and do a PhD on curating performance art? Most performance artists that I know are not curatable. Because when you think you know what they're going to say, I know, can you please get me a horse and a stable? Like, no, forget the horse. I think cut the horse in half and then I'll pull the organs and I'll wrap it around my neck and it's like, how do you curate that, you know?
Yeah.
You can't curate it. It's like, and I feel like, for me, like the future of performance art has to be in us taking back the urgency of what performance art is. And because I think that if we lose that urgency, we will become like a definition, an academic definition, that will try to philosophize what experience the experience that performance art gives is something that you can't capture it in words. And even when you try, you create a new universe with words, because the experience of performance is so powerful. I don't even know how to encapsulate it. I just believe that what I hope is that there is a space where we can take back that urgency. And in a way, I go back to what Verena said, which is that we don't need to be tied down by money. We need to be allowed to have the freedom to understand how to creatively make the work that feeds us and feeds the mass as well. Because in every situation, I keep thinking about, I really actually felt a sense of grief when I was looking at what was going on with all these protests and with everything that's occurring in the world. And I was like, where are the performers who don't care and who will make the work that needs to be made to shine a torch in the face of the oppressors to say, we're here, we see. And I keep thinking maybe that the time for that will come, but also maybe the time for that may never come, because, there is the realities of living in this world and what it means for us to navigate. But, even just being in a university and thinking about arts and humanities and, performance education, and I think it's you can never fully give everything to students when it comes to performance. You almost have to give a sanitized version in order to not, offend some people, get arrested, or hurt the students, in whatever way. But then I think about these spaces that you and Verena create and the spaces that other artists that I know that are still committed to practice create. And I think these are the spaces that are needed more of now. These spaces are the spaces where that urgency can be taken back. Because what these spaces create are opportunities for a re-education of what you think you know versus what you really need to know. And I think if we can achieve that, I think the future will be great. But if we don't achieve it, I think what we will have is maybe we'll have an underground system. Because I just can't imagine that performance art will ever disappear. But I think it might become that needle again that will operate and exist in the space until the time comes when it needs to be found, and then it will be found when it's felt.
Chinasa, my friend, would you like to address something else? Well, I cherish our encounters with Verena together, and your truthful words, which are they come from a place of wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you.